Dino Crisis, one of those classic franchises that seem to have come and gone in just a few years, but has left a lasting impact on the gaming world. Playing off the tail end of the Jurassic Park hype wave and pushing the PlayStation graphics to the max, this was a fantastic dino game that holds a special place in many a gamer's heart. And, well, as things go, a fan has remade the game in Unreal Engine, and today we're checking it out. Alright, so if you're totally unfamiliar with this 1999 PlayStation era game, it was essentially Resident Evil, but with dinosaurs instead of zombies. It actually came out a few months before Resident Evil 3, but unlike the Resident Evil games, Dino Crisis utilized a custom in-house game engine to render everything in 3D, rather than the more common approach of 3D models on pre-rendered backgrounds that was pretty common during this time. The reviews of the game were solid, and it sold an impressive 2.5 million copies on the original PlayStation. Sadly, 4 years later, Dino Crisis 3 launched to mixed reviews, and Capcom seemingly threw in the towel on the entire franchise. Which is why we're not getting new Dino Crisis games anymore. Just Crisis games, and those don't even have dinosaurs at all. However, 20 plus years later, and the franchise is still well regarded as one of the few good games where you can shoot dinosaurs. Everybody seems to remember all the cool dino games, and yet we're not making a lot of new ones, just the indie scene. So with no reboots, remakes, or sequels on the horizon, it seems like fans of the franchise have taken things into their own hands with Dino Crisis Rebirth. It's an Unreal Engine remake of the original game that overhauls its tank-like controls and environments with a third-person camera system and modern game visuals. It's currently available on the developer's itch.io page for free, and while some of the improvements to the gameplay and environment are certainly welcome, it also makes some major changes to the game's presentation and puzzles that some may consider a bit of a downgrade. It's an interesting package. That said, this was all developed by a single person as opposed to an entire development studio, which makes it incredibly impressive that they were able to get this far with the concept. Let's start off by looking at the coolest stuff. Visually, Rebirth hits way above its pay grade. It's not an incredibly polished or cohesive looking game, but the environments are detailed and really well lit. Amusingly, some of the models, like these dead scientists, look like they're 8 feet tall, which I would consider more of a minor issue. But aside from some of those fun little bugs, Rebirth is an impressive looking project. It's certainly made to a high enough standard that it doesn't pull me out of the experience at all. I felt fully immersed in a jungle island filled with dinosaurs. Now, if it's been a while since you played the original game, which I wouldn't blame you, there's some pretty nice improvements here, like loading times between areas. Boy oh boy, were those PlayStation 1 loading sequences fun to wait through. The original game had those classic loading screen animations that showed your character going through doors or up some stairs because new rooms couldn't be loaded in seamlessly. Rebirth carries this over, but the load times are much faster, so going from room to room or even having to backtrack just doesn't feel anywhere near as tedious as the original game. The progress is also a bit more linear. If you're not excited about navigating maze-like levels, backtracking, or having to keep a mental record of key items and codes, Rebirth kind of streamlines the whole experience by doing away with a lot of that backtracking. Unlocked doors are now clearly marked with blue light, so you can tell at a glance where you can actually go, and unlocking doors to progress mostly boils down to just finding nearby keys. That said, I certainly wish the puzzles and more maze-like designs of the original game had been carried over more. Rebirth often feels like less exploring a science base and more just like walking through a series of connected corridors. But I think the developer was well aware that a one-to-one remake of the original game's levels and puzzles would have just been way too much for them to take on, so I understand the sacrifices. It's probably more accurate to call Rebirth a reimagining or a heavily inspired game by the original series instead of labeling it as a direct remake. There are a lot of elements that both games share, like being set on the tropical island that you airdrop into, but there's almost none of the original game's cutscenes or even narrative. So if you haven't played the original game, you might be at a bit of a loss as to what's going on. Rebirth opens with your character working on a computer, but there's no dialogue or legible text to indicate what they're doing. In the original game, this is a briefing sequence that sets up the core plot of the story with voice acting and text describing the situation you're about to be dropped into. Even the drop sequence cutscene is different, with you surviving the drop while your partner gets eaten by a T-Rex in the descent. In the original, you drop with 3 other characters. One of them gets attacked in the jungle, but the other 2 make it to safety and help you during the opening sequence of the game. Now, once you're actually in control of your main character, it's nice to see how a modern reimagining of this game plays like. For starters, it uses a third-person perspective instead of the fixed cameras and tank-like controls of the original. It's not that the original's controls were outright bad, and they actually do some things better than Rebirth does, but it feels less clumsy to play with modern controls. It lends itself to being a more immersive experience where you feel like you're the character as opposed to somebody giving signals to the character on what they should do. The original game often felt more like a diorama than an experience that you were the character in. Probably one of the best things about Rebirth is just its ability to ramp up the tension and horror elements that the original game did. Your first encounter with a raptor is similar to the kitchen scene in Jurassic Park, and throughout the opening of the game you just get glimpses of dinosaurs eating people or slowly stalking through the halls. There's a scene where you have to squeeze through a narrow spot in the walls towards a raptor, and it's got some genuine thrills to it despite the gameplay just being hold forward until you reach the end. The way this developer has constructed these horror scenes to be so effective is impressive, especially considering that they're, well, replacing an entire studio that did it for the original game. But for the most part, the experience seems most effective at showing you the horror rather than letting you experience it directly, which in some cases can be more effective. But once it comes to the actual combat, it's in a bit of a rough state. Rebirth introduces smaller dinosaurs that you fight, and they're incredibly hard to keep track of. The main issue with this is that the camera easily flies into your body when you're too close to a wall, making it pretty much impossible to see anything. But there's also range limits to how high and how low you can look, so when the little dinosaurs get up to your feet, you literally can't aim low enough to actually shoot them. To make up for this though, there's some pretty generous auto aim, so you can quickly shoot most of the enemies without too much fuss. You just need to keep them at a bit of a distance. One thing the remake does really well is representing the jungle that surrounds the base. The jungle was just too complex to render on the original game, so most of the exterior areas of the game just feel super sparse, if having any like plant models at all. And in fact, the original game had a jungle level that was planned but had to be scrapped entirely. Rebirth is able to add tons of lush tropical plants surrounding the base that gives it a way more realistic feel and honestly improves the ambiance so much. There's even a nod to the original game's T-Rex smashing through an office window, with one just outside of a massive panoramic window. And this window being the only thing separating you from a giant dinosaur is pretty unnerving. The foliage and rain pouring down just helps set the scene even better. Now, Rebirth reminds me a little bit about the debates within Capcom's recent Resident Evil remakes. They're incredibly competent and good-looking games, but they make similar design changes that Rebirth does, with a different perspective and updated gameplay. Those remakes obviously have the people and resources of a whole studio behind them to make them captivating, so it's impressive how far this developer got with his vision of that style of a remake. It's far from perfect, it has plenty of jank to it, and frankly it's not even what I would call fully faithful, but what it lacks for in accuracy or polish, it makes up for in just being so impressive that a single dude is trying to remake a great game that was originally built by a whole studio. It's wild to me that there haven't been bigger studio attempts to recapture some of the Dino gaming hype, especially now with the high-end graphics engines that could probably push things to the next level. There are some cool looking indie projects in the works right now, so I'll be keeping my eyes on those in the meantime. I'd be curious to know if you guys ever played Dino Crisis back in the day. It's a bit of an older title, but one that is remembered very fondly among gamers who played it. Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop me a like, subscribe for more content like it, and ding that notification bell to beat the YouTube algorithm with me. Up next, check out my coverage of the latest update for Road to Vostok, another solo dev game that is making something that feels like Stalker meets Tarkov, and it looks awesome. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.